So with having the Developer tab activated, we now have access to Form controls and ActiveX controls. And these controls can be located underneath the Developer tab, and within the Controls group, we can select Insert. And here we can see the different options for both types of controls. So underneath Form controls, we have a command button, a combo box, checkbox, option buttons, scroll bars, and so on. And the ActiveX controls share similar options, but just a few more. Form controls are geared more towards working just inside of Excel, and ActiveX controls lean more towards VBA. So I will reveal a few differences between both of these controls, and depending on what you're trying to achieve inside of your spreadsheet, one may be suited better depending on your situation. So for this video, we will be adding a Form button and then an ActiveX button. So that way we can walk through a few of the key differences between the two. So first, let's add a Form control button, which is this icon here in the top left. If we give this a click and click and drag to insert our button, it automatically prompts us to choose which macro that we want to assign to this button. We can just choose the For Next macro to highlight the A's like we did in the previous video. So we can select For Next and click OK. Unlike shapes, form controls don't allow us to change many properties of this button. For example, we can come in and change the text of this button and type in highlight A's. And then if we get out of the text box and right click this button and we come up to the Shape Format tab, you can see that Shape Fill, Shape Outline, Shape Effects is all grayed out. Even if we come to the Home tab, you can see that a lot of these commands are grayed out. So really, the only properties that we can change for this button is the font property. And we can do that by giving this button a right click and go to Format Control. And underneath the Font tab, we can select the font that we want to use, the font style, so if we want to make it bold, we can. Change the font size, and we can also change the font color. So if we wanted to, we can choose blue and click OK. And that's pretty much it for changing the properties of this button. But if we come over to our Width Curve column and clear the fill color for these cells, now if we give our Form Control button a click, it still executes our For Next macro. Now let me show you what we can do with the ActiveX command button. So if we come up to the Developer tab, click Insert, select our button, click and drag, and if we come up here within the Controls group and click Properties, now we have access to all these properties that we can change. So within these properties, we can change the name of this command button. And currently it's called Command Button 1, and this is the name that we would use in our code if we wanted to refer to this button. So if we wanted to have this button highlight the failing grades within the Width Curve column, we could give this button a more distinct name. So instead of Command Button 1, we can type in Fail CB, short for Command Button. And if you noticed, that doesn't change the actual text that's on the button. It still says Command Button 1. If we want to change this text, we have to go to the Caption property and change this to Highlight F's. And unlike the Form control, we can actually change the background color of this button. So if we come up to the Back Color property and select this dropdown, we have a few options here, or we can select this other tab and select a color of your liking. So let's say that we want to make this button red. We can do that. And we also have access to change the font properties, change how our mouse pointer looks once we hover over this button, or even insert a picture inside the button. So you can tell there's a lot more properties that we can change for the ActiveX control over the form control. Now to assign a macro for this ActiveX control, we have a few options. So if we double click this control, it opens up the code module for this control. You can see that it inserted a sub called _CB, which is the name of our control, _click, meaning that if a user clicks on this control, it will execute all the lines of code within this sub. So we could write all the code over again to highlight all the failing grades within the with curve column, which was our do until loop, or since we already have the code written inside of our loops module, we can just call that sub. And all we have to do is type in call and the name of our sub, which is do until. So when a user clicks on this control, it's going to call the do until sub, which is located within the loops module, and it will execute these lines of code. So let's try it out. If we come over to our workbook, click out of the control, we have to get out of the design mode in order to click this control. And then I will also close out of properties. And now if we click this control, it calls our do until sub and highlights all the failing grades within the with curve column. So even though we can assign a macro to a shape, form control, or ActiveX control, all of them have their differences. Shapes and form controls are a little bit easier to work with, especially if you're just working inside of Excel. But ActiveX controls have a little bit more flexibility due to all the properties that we can change, and they can be used as objects inside of your code. But one very important thing to keep in mind about ActiveX controls is that they are not available for Mac users. So if you were building an Excel project for someone, it's a smart idea to ask what operating system they are using, because you don't want to create this whole project using ActiveX controls and then find out that they're on a Mac, and then you would have to go back in, delete all the ActiveX controls, and either use shapes or form controls to trigger your macros.